Good afternoon, and welcome to today's University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium webinar. My name is Patricia Barton, and I'm the Senior Associate at SRCD and Consortium Coordinator. We're excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Excellence for All Children, Addressing Issues of Equity and Culture in Teaching. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to say a few words about the consortium and about using GoToWebinar. The University-Based Child and Family Policy Consortium is a network of more than 25 university-based institutions, including centers, schools, departments, and programs that have an interest in child and family policy. We are organized around three main purposes. First, to share the latest findings and strategies for conducting policy-relevant research and to facilitate collaboration across our member institutions. Second, to encourage cross-disciplinary undergraduate and graduate training to support the next generation of child and family policy researchers. And third, to foster effective translation between research, practice, and policy audiences. The consortium is run in collaboration with the Society for Research in Child Development and hosts a number of webinars each year on a variety of topics. If you are interested in learning more about the consortium, having your institution join the consortium, or if you would like to join our listserv, please see the information on this slide. Just a quick word before we begin about the technology we are using today. We are using GoToWebinar to host this webinar. All of the attendees are muted. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the question box on your screen to submit them. Our speakers will try to answer as many questions as possible during the moderated Q&A at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. After the call ends, I will be uploading it to SRCD's YouTube channel and will share that link with all of you. If you have colleagues or friends who were not able to make today's webinar but are interested in the content, please share the link with them. I will also be sharing the slides from today's webinar. And now I'd like to turn things over to our moderator, Dr. Iheoma Iruka, to introduce our topic and speaker.
Thank you for that, Patricia. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Curenton, a good friend and colleague. She's an associate professor and director of the Ecology of Readiness lab at the Boston University School of Education. Her research focuses primarily on the development of low-income and minority children in various contexts and related state and federal policies. This webinar will be adapted from a plenary session that we were both part of at the 2016 National Research Conference on Early Childhood. With that, I introduce Stephanie Curenton.
Good afternoon. I am so happy to be here with you today to share this updated version of the presentation from last summer. Next slide. So for the outline of my presentation, I will spend my time today addressing four main points. One has to do with talking about the population that I will be referring to as the culturally and linguistically diverse learners, which I call CULD learners. The second has to do with definition. What is culturally relevant anti-bias instruction? The third point has to do with rationale. Why do we need it? And the fourth point is about function. How can we improve teaching practices and instruction? Next slide. So children under the age of 18 living in the U.S. are becoming increasingly diverse. White children are still the majority at 48%, but Hispanic populations continue to grow and is increasing currently, and it's currently at 22%. That's followed by Blacks at 13%. And there are other smaller diverse groups of children that include Asian Pacific Islander, American Indian, Alaska Natives, and the increasing number of multiracial children. So even within this diversity, the vast majority of U.S. children are native born, 97% of them are, and only 3% of our children are foreign born. The ethnic and racial diversity is why we see such linguistic diversity in our population. Of the total population over age 5, 79% speak a language other than English at home. The 21% who do speak, 79% speak only English at home, but 21% speak another language at home. Spanish is the #1 other language spoken in American homes, and it accounts for 13% of the other household language spoken. and it's the most widely spoken other language among children aged 5 to 17. The other household languages include Indo-European languages, but not counting Spanish in that, and Asian Pacific Islander languages, and what they call sort of a generalized other category of languages. So this diversity in household language lets us know how many dual language learners we have in our early childhood population. And it's important to note that teachers of dual language learners have to remember that not all dual language learner families share the same experiences, national customs, or even the same dialect. There are dialect variations across children's home languages. There are differences in terms of the ages when children were first exposed to English. There are differences between the parents' fluencies and literacies in English as well as in their other languages. And there are differences between the degrees of a family's linguistic isolation. So the extent to which children are growing up in these multilingual, bilingual, or bidialectal households vary by children's race and ethnicity. And as you can see from the slide, more than 3/4 of Hispanic and Asian children grow up in households where other languages are spoken. And that's next followed by Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander children. And some of these children are speaking the Hawaiian language or even the Pidgin language that is popular on the island. And then there's also about 1/4 of our native population who is speaking languages, other languages at home that can include the vast number of tribal languages. And what you can see from the slide, the Blacks are the lowest group of CALD learners who are reported to speak another language at home. And the languages they may speak can include African languages or French. However, I always like to point out that I believe this estimation is an underestimation of the language diversity within this group, because the pidgins, creoles, and vernaculars that this Black population often speaks is not recorded in the census due to linguistic politics around what is deemed a language or not. So linguistic diversity is definitely a strength for individual children. Research shows that by middle childhood and adolescence, children who are bilingual or multilingual have more cognitive flexibility and greater metalinguistic awareness. And not even to mention the later economic benefits to society that we will see in adulthood when we have a workforce that is multilingual and equipped to participate in the global economy. So despite these positives of having a more cultural and language diverse society, CALD children also face quite a number of hardships in society due to racism, and I will talk about that next. The first hardship that CALD learners face is poverty. They are more likely to live in poverty than white children. Over 1/3 of Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Hispanic children live in poverty. And children living in poverty are more likely than those not in poverty to experience adverse life events. Many experience illnesses or health concerns such as chronic ear infections, toxic stress, or mental health issues within their families. So the CALD children face the disadvantage of poverty, but also within the context of living in a society that fails to provide an adequate safety net for low-income families. And presently in our society, we are considering limiting basic human rights such as access to health care and access to free public schools. So this sort of harsh political environment in which children in poverty are living not only exacerbates the hardships that their families face on the individual level, but it also exacerbates the fact that their family has a limited income to make necessary and or discretionary purchases. Another hardship that CALD children face is related to racial segregation in housing. Work by LaRue and Goyette report that Blacks are more likely to live in racially segregated neighborhoods compared to whites, Hispanics, and Asians. This is problematic because these segregated neighborhoods tend to be high poverty neighborhoods. And again, 1/3 of Black and American Indian children live in high poverty neighborhoods, and about 1/4 of Hispanics do as well. These high poverty neighborhoods and urban environments can be overcrowded, noisy, and lack basic infrastructure like clean water. and high poverty rural neighborhoods can be isolated and also lack infrastructure such as water or internet access. So these neighborhoods are also subject to redlining in terms of access to goods and services like insurance, healthcare, and even full-service supermarkets. And another reason why this residential segregation is problematic is because children are assigned to schools based on where they live. So children who are confined to high poverty neighborhoods are then filtered into high poverty schools. And high poverty schools have several challenges, which we will focus on in the next slide. The first challenge is a disparity in resources at all levels, from local funding due to the limited tax base in the poor neighborhoods, to less experienced and or qualified teachers and other school personnel, to poor quality buildings and textbooks and materials. Linda Darling-Hammond refers to this as an opportunity gap. And she characterizes this phrase as a way to move away from the focus on the achievement gap that is characterizing individual children's scores. Instead, she proposes that we focus on the structural and systematic issues across schools that serve different populations of children. And it's clear that the opportunity gap is confounded between race and ethnicity and social economic status. But the other challenges that I list here on the slide facing CALD children in schools are clearly the result of a legacy of racism, regardless of social economic status. And these challenges include a Eurocentric curriculum taught in English, or nearly exclusively in English, and teachers' unconscious implicit biases and lowered expectations of children of color, and harsher disciplinary actions. So it's even important to note that there have been some reports that CALD children, particularly blacks, face harsher disciplinary actions than white children, even for the same violations. So also, black children are more often disciplined for subjective violations, such as being insubordinate or defiant, as compared to white children. So now that we have talked about sort of who CALD children are, let's turn to talk about the definition of what culturally relevant anti-bias instruction is. So the first point I want to make in terms of definition is the fact that equity is different from equality. Equity is about giving people what they need. And even more so, sometimes there have to be what I call equity adjustments because of the long history of inequality. So think about it like this. In terms of equity adjustments, you might not only need to provide someone with a shoe that fits, but also to provide socks to some children. So Fowler talks about equality of opportunity, which is the notion that educational inputs are equally distributed among groups of students. But we already talked about how this is not true. There is an opportunity gap. So striving for education equality is gravely important. However, opportunities cannot be equalized when the disparities in health and education exist from birth and from prior generations, and when such disparities span multiple aspects of a child's ecological system. So equality only provides comparable resources, but what is actually needed is an equity adjustment for what Gloria Ladson-Billings calls the educational debt. The next key term that is important for our discussion is the notion of culture. So I'd like to share a story about a colleague who was a quantitative psychologist who once said to me that culture was what people used to explain statistical variance that could not be accounted for. So I was baffled by his statement, and I totally disagreed with him. He saw culture as an afterthought. It mattered only after you had looked at everything else. And on the contrary, I see culture as a beginning point. It is where we start, and it undergirds everything that we do. So culture, like language, is the quintessential aspect of human nature. Culture is in our social practices, our beliefs, our values, and our behaviors that we intentionally or unintentionally pass down from generation to generation. It shapes our communication patterns, our interactions, and our preferences. And all of us have culture. In fact, the institution of education has a culture. Its cultural tradition is based on the beliefs, values, practices of Anglo-Saxon Protestant traditions that dominated the U.S. during the 1600s. Gloria Ladson-Billings explains that often as educators we practice generic educational pedagogies that we deem to be culturally neutral, when in fact these pedagogies are propagating the very tenets of the dominant white culture from which the education system was originally derived. And so I argue that we owe it to call children to expand our definition and our view of good pedagogy and practice, because they're valuable members of our schools and our communities and our larger society. And a quote from one of my favorite authors, Sonia Nieto, eloquently describes what it means to incorporate culture into schools. So Nieto is quoting from the paper of one of her students who was a bilingual teacher, and the student's name was Lisette Roman. She says, "To have knowledge of another culture does not mean to be able to repeat one or two words in a student's language, nor is it to celebrate an activity or sing a song related to their culture. To acknowledge and respect is to be able to understand and apply knowledge to everyday classroom activities. It is to be able to make changes or modifications in one's curriculum or pedagogy when the needs of the students have not been served. It is to be patient, tolerant, curious, creative, eager to learn, and most important, non-authoritarian with students. In order for a teacher to promote excellence in education, there has to be a real and honest connection between the needs and cultural values of teachers and students, and this is culturally responsive education." So scholars like Gloria Ladson-Billings, Sonia Nieto, and Geneva Gay have shaped our views around what we believe to be culturally responsive pedagogy and practices in the K through 12 world. There are other scholars like Louise Derman Sparks and Julie Olson Edwards who in early childhood who have actively incorporated themes of social justice and opposition to bias and discrimination within the early childhood curriculum and framework. Iheoma Iruka and I combined these two frameworks, the literature from these two frameworks, and developed what we termed culturally relevant anti-bias framework for education, particularly for early childhood educators, as well as the clinicians and practitioners working with this age group. And later on in the presentation, I will describe a measurement tool that we're currently developing and how we use the term equitable social cultural interactions as a way to sort of operationalize what we view as this culturally relevant anti-bias framework and what it might look like in the classroom. So just to reiterate sort of the 4 instructional goals of culturally relevant anti-bias instruction, this is from our book, and it's based on the work by Derman, Sparks, and Edwards. And there are sort of 4 goals for this type of instruction. And goal 1 is for each child to demonstrate self-awareness, confidence, family pride, and positive social identities. Goal 2, each child will express comfort and joy with human diversity, accurate language for human differences, and deep, caring human connections. And number 3, each child will increasingly recognize unfairness, have language to describe unfairness, and to understand that unfairness hurts both the recipient and the perpetrator. And lastly, each child will demonstrate empowerment and the skills to act with others or alone against prejudice and or discriminatory actions. In order for teachers to activate these goals and to use this framework, they must have a core of cultural competence, which Diller and colleagues describe this core of cultural competence as consisting of understanding the history of cultural interactions, being able to integrate culture in all aspects of an organization, of a classroom, of teaching and materials, and by adapting activities to be more culturally relevant, and by valuing diversity and respecting that people have different traditions and norms. Also, culturally competent teachers engage in self-awareness and reflection that guides their practice and their interactions with children. And also, culturally competent children are active, culturally competent teachers are active in assessing their organization's culture. And what I would add to sort of this core of cultural competence is the idea that teachers, culturally competent teachers, need to verbalize explicit opposition to racism and bias within their classroom and within the educational system at large. So now that we have an idea of how we have been defining culturally relevant anti-bias instruction, let's move on to talk about the rationale for sort of why we need it and how this affects children's lives in the classroom. So the number one rationale is it's needed because of the legacy of racism within our U.S. education system. So the first public school in the United States was the Boston Latin School that was opened on April 23rd in 1635. And the school still operates today, making it the oldest existing school in the country. The school was created to educate affluent white boys. And prominent alumni include Ben Franklin, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, just to name a few. The school did not become co-ed until 1972, when girls were from the Boston Latin Girls School were allowed to enroll in the Boston Latin School. And it's unclear when the school became racially integrated, but what we do know is in the 1600s, it was explicitly created for affluent whites. And next, you see a picture 200 years later where the students were still all white boys, and they're all wearing very nicely tailored suits. And then you have the picture on the right, which is from 1950. It's a picture from the cafeteria in which you can see one black boy that I have circled. This school is one of the top schools in the entire country, and today it is known as an exam school, meaning that children have to test into the school. And the school population does not reflect the demographic diversity within the city. A disproportionate number of white students still attend the school. And unfortunately, the school is plagued by racial incidents. Black students in particular have brought lawsuits against the school several times for discrimination. So this brings me to a quote by King and Mitchell when they describe the history of racism in the U.S. schools. They say institutional racism in school still makes it necessary to teach Black youth that surviving this system requires more than being equal or getting an equal opportunity to compete. No matter what we do to prepare them and protect them, from society's hostile forces, it is still a society divided along racial lines. So the point of this slide is to really give you a concrete example of how our educational system began and who it was designed to serve, and how for over 400 years the system was set up to serve a white population exclusively. It is only within the last 50 or so years that our school system has really become integrated to accept whites and to accept Hispanic children into the system. And even though the school system has allowed these children to come into the system, there still has not been change in terms of the philosophy, the curriculum, and the training of teachers to accommodate the new students that are coming into the system. The second rationale for the need for culturally responsive anti-bias instruction is because it can help teachers recognize the strengths and positive abilities of CALD students. Research explains that teachers are less likely to recommend CALD students for gifted programs, even when these children demonstrate advanced abilities. Teachers specifically need training in a culturally responsive anti-bias framework because they've been taught to view a Eurocentric cultural model of learning as the ideal. So, for example, such Eurocentric traditions emphasize individualism, independence, and the value of scientific inquiry that takes the form of a linear and logical approach to problem solving as the highest level of reasoning. So, on the contrary, many ethnic minority cultures focus on collectivism, interdependence, and a value of a holistic form of reasoning that relies heavily on shared knowledge from others and contextualized experiences. And so this distinction between these two cultural traditions result in not only differences in how children might prefer to learn, such as working in groups versus working independently, but also how children express their knowledge, how they communicate what they know. Several researchers describe how cultures can be classified along a continuum of low context versus high context communication styles. And in a low context communication style, the primary emphasis is on explicit verbal expressions and abstract descriptions. And thus it relies heavily on diction, on grammar, and on a linear narrative structure. But on the contrary, a high context communication style relies heavily on implicit nonverbal expressions, such as facial expressions, and it emphasizes life experiences, social context, and connections among people. So many called cultures are characterized as high context communication styles, as having high context communication styles. Therefore, children from these cultures might face a conflict during communication when they're talking with their teachers who were trained to teach and converse with their students using this low context communication style. So a poignant example of this comes from my colleague Dina Castro's book, The New Voices. So the example says, Miss Brown asked children in her classroom to describe an apple. Martita raised her hand and started telling the teacher, the other day I was in the kitchen with my mom because she asked me to help her make a pie. Miss Brown interrupted Martita and said, I asked what an apple is. Then another student raised his hand and Miss Brown said, okay, Jimmy, tell me what an apple is. Jimmy responded, an apple is a fruit. It is round, it is red on the outside, and it is yellowish in the inside. Miss Brown said, that is correct. Good job, Jimmy. Martita kept quiet for the rest of the school day. So this example illustrates what can happen when a child from a high context communication style engages in classroom conversations with a teacher who is operating from a low context communication style. Martita began by describing the social context in which she learned about apples by helping her mom make a pie. But Miss Brown thought that Martita misunderstood the question and she dismissed her answer. Miss Brown could have responded in a culturally responsive manner by listening to Martita first, describe her life experiences that were the foundation for her knowledge, and then by asking specific follow-up questions that would scaffold Martita's articulation of sort of this concrete, abstract description of the object. And such an example characterizes the needs for training that builds teachers' abilities to engage diverse learners in classroom conversations, especially since classroom conversations are the primary mode of open-ended collaborative instruction in the classroom. The third rationale for why we need this type of framework is that school personnel's implicit biases shape their interactions with children. So research shows that white teachers report less positive relationships with African American and Hispanic children, and they report more positive relationships with white children. We also know that teachers especially have a hard time forming secure attachment relationships with these children, and that they report that the relationships are often conflicted. We know that teachers do not engage in as much one-on-one instruction with called children in the classroom, and they don't have as many sort of social interactions or conversations with them. And we already talked about how African Americans are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white students, even for similar infractions. So these differences in terms of how called children are treated in the classroom are unconscious. The vast majority of teachers are not willfully deciding to have poor relationships with called children. Instead, these problems happen on an unconscious level and are the result of what the social psychology literature has known for a long time as implicit racial bias. So implicit biases are attitudes, values, or stereotypes that unconsciously affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions. And we can have biases related to many social identities. There are even biases related to weight and size. However, the most studied biases are implicit racial biases. And there's a strong body of evidence showing that implicit biases is what someone referred to as an equal opportunity virus. And what that means is that everyone has what would be considered a pro-white bias, meaning that whites are viewed more positively. They're seen as smarter, they're seen as less threatening, they're seen as more friendly, they're seen as less aggressive, the children are seen as more well-behaved, etc. We know that even children have these implicit biases, even as young as preschool. And these implicit biases are learned through direct and indirect messages, images, and interactions in our society. So lastly, I want to talk about function in terms of how could we change this and how could we potentially make our teaching practices better. And so one answer to that is related to professional development and instruction, of course, and the strong need that we have for that, for professional development that really has a culturally responsive framework and focus. But another way to think about this and to another supplement to add to that professional development is really thinking about observational measures so that we can give teachers feedback about what they're doing in the classroom and change their behavior. Because as I mentioned before, teachers are not willfully engaging in sort of these biased interactions. These things are unconscious. So one of the things that we've been trying to do as a team with Iheoma and Bryant Jensen, Tonya Durden, and Marisha Humphreys is developing a measure that we call Assessing Classroom Social Cultural Equity Scale. It's the access measure. And our goal here is to provide a reliable and valid assessment of equitable social cultural interactions within early childhood classrooms ranging from pre through third grade. And we view this measure as ideally being able to be used for research as well as professional development. And we define equitable social cultural interactions as bidirectional interactions between teachers and children and between peers and peers in the classroom that foster the following things. One is an open classroom dialogue that encourages children to express their knowledge and share their worldview and their social identity. Also, interactions that foster connections between children's home language traditions and their school language in order to ensure that all children's voices and experiences are valued and heard in the classroom. Third, we view these interactions as fostering a nurturing and affirming classroom climate in which children have the freedom to express their unique personalities, emotions, abilities, and ideas, and to demonstrate their leadership abilities. Fourth, these interactions will foster instruction that is connected to children's lived experiences at home and in their communities, and that is grounded in peer collaboration and a sense of cooperation and communal effort. And fifth, we view them as fostering intentional and explicit emphasis on building positive cultural identities, appreciating diversity, and striving for social justice. We view them as promoting equitable learning opportunities in which all children are provided with opportunities to participate, grow, and are treated with respect and dignity. By providing equitable discipline based on redirection and encouragement for positive behavior that utilizes social emotional problem solving rather than judgmental chastising. And lastly, we view these types of interactions in the classroom as incorporating intellectually stimulating instructional content, curriculum, and viewpoints that challenge the status quo of present-day knowledge and the social hierarchy, and that incorporate children's ethnic and social political heritage. So there are two domains for the access measure, and one domain we call challenging inequity. And in that domain, we have three dimensions. One is what we call equitable learning opportunities. The second is challenging the status quo. And the third is equitable discipline. So in terms of equitable learning, we are assessing teachers' ability to make sure that all children have opportunities to participate in learning activities, such as all children are being called on, all children are being engaged. If children aren't being engaged, that they are brought back and redirected into the interaction in a positive way. In terms of challenging the status quo knowledge, we are looking at sort of items that assess how often the teacher is bringing in knowledge that presents a counter narrative to what is presented in our common curriculum. So how the teacher is incorporating knowledge from children's social political histories, from children's heritage, and how she is also incorporating activities and related to getting children to think about fairness and social justice. The third dimension includes items about equitable discipline, and these items look specifically in terms of how teachers are using discipline in the classroom and whether the style of discipline that is used is consistent across all children, including called children as well as non-called children, and whether or not this discipline is just simply punitive versus whether or not the discipline is enacted in a way that will really help children sort of grow and develop more complex problem-solving skills and self-regulation skills. And lastly, the second domain we call bridging social cultural connections. And in this domain, we look at cross-ethnic peer collaboration and connections to home. And so items on this cross-ethnic peer collaboration include looking at whether or not there are opportunities and interactions in the classroom in which you see children from diverse groups interacting with each other in meaningful ways, whether or not they are smiling and laughing with each other and talking to each other, whether or not they are working together on a group project, whether or not the called children are fully integrated into the classroom and into activities with their peers. And in terms of connection to home, the items that we have in this dimension really look at sort of how the teacher uses language in the classroom in a meaningful way to connect between the home language and the school language. So looking at whether or not the teacher is using translanguaging to build meaning to when she's talking to children and sharing instructional context or instructional information, whether she's using code switching. And also the connection to families about bringing in experiences that children might have in their home and in their communities and materials that they might encounter in their home and their communities and using them as the basis for instruction. So those are, I want to say thank you. And I have my contact information here. And I guess we can open it for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for such a rich and thorough and thoughtful presentation. And I just want to add that I'm one of the byproducts, actually, of Boston Latin School, as you may know. So, yes, I did take an exam to get in. So, with that, I want to sort of, we got several questions ahead of time, and I have several questions of my own, and I imagine we'll have more from the participants as well. But so one of the first questions that we received is there an assumption that there are a set of sort of known universal cultural and social interactions that work for all children, right, regardless of their culture? So is there universal sort of things that we should care about as it concerns social culture interactions?
So I would say no, there is not sort of a set of things that sort of work across all cultures, because cultures are different. I think that most of the literature around culturally responsive practices, and even what we tried to put forward in terms of the culturally relevant anti-bias framework, is one in which it's about cultural responsiveness, meaning that whatever the culture is that children bring to the classroom, the teacher is able to learn about that culture and respond to that culture in a meaningful way.
Okay.
So no, there's not one specific culture.
Okay, so then what would you say to a teacher who would say, well, I have kids from all over, beyond just the common African American, Latino, what about they have, you know, from other countries, immigrants? So what would be your response to that in terms of how do they address some of those individual groups or subgroups in terms of social cultural interactions?
So this is a really good question, and I've been thinking about this a lot. So the measure that we have now, which is called the access, evolved from a measure that Bryant first created called the CASI-P. And the CASI-P was more of an instrument to really dive deep into culture specifically and trying to assess what culture is and trying to assess culture across sort of multiple groups. Because of the very nature of because of even what this question is bringing up is sort of that's something that's very difficult to do. And because we ran into that difficulty, sort of my thinking on this started to evolve, because it is very difficult to try to develop a one-stop sort of one-size-fits-all approach to culturally responsive pedagogy. So what I would say in terms of the access, when you really look at the access and look at the items, what the access is doing is really talking more about equity for children who are from different cultural and social groups. So it's really about how the teacher responds to inequity, how she challenges inequity in her classroom, how she structures things so that she's challenging inequity. And it's not about sort of culture per se. There is one aspect specifically though that fits very well in terms of what the traditional literature talks about as the culturally responsive pedagogy, and that has to do with the dimension that talks about challenging the status quo. So in terms of challenging the status quo, that is something where teachers can easily bring in a variety of cultural and heritage groups into the classroom, because for one, we know that the status quo is that dominant white Eurocentric curriculum that is taught in schools. So by challenging the status quo, there's an opportunity for teachers to bring in literature and activities and history from other groups. And so in that, it's still not creating sort of that one size fits all kind of culture thing, but it can explicitly focus on different cultural groups and sort of bring examples from those cultural groups into the classroom, but still do it from a way where it's really focusing on issues of equity, because the goal with introducing that type of content is to upset the status quo, to show that there are different ways of thinking, that there are different sources of knowledge, that there have been stories that have been excluded, etc.
Thank you for that. So in follow-up to that question, where could potentially the participants, there was a question about where can they get more information about the development of pro-white bias or even white privilege, you know, in the larger scheme of things. Where can they get more information about that? And then to follow up on that, when do you think the access to will be available?
Okay. So the first question about where can they get more information about sort of the like privilege and I think you said the pro-white bias as well?
Yes.
Okay, so in terms of, I think that for early childhood, one of the books that I just really like is the Antibias curriculum with Louise Derman Sparks and her colleague Edwards. I think that that is a great source to start from, and they even have a book that is called What If All the Children Are White? That can be used in those classrooms that are just not very diverse at all, but in which children should still be learning about anti-bias curriculum and about social justice, etc. So that's one thing with the privilege. In terms of the issues about bias and the pro-white bias, there is a report from the Curenton Institute from Ohio State University that is a very nice summary of implicit bias, and it includes how bias is demonstrated across education and across health, and it's a very nice summary for people who may not be coming from sort of that social psychology field where a lot of that research is done. But that brings me to the other point, is that if you really want a very thorough, deep, rich, empirical understanding of implicit bias, you can go and read the social psychology literature in particular.
And then the last one about access availability.
Yes, so we are diligently working on the access tool. We've been working on it for over a year now, and I would anticipate that we will have a product to share definitely to our research partners by the end of the summer, and maybe sometime in the fall semester of fall 2017, we might have a publication that is sort of submitted, and some data to be analyzed as well. Some data to be analyzed about sort of the validity and reliability of the measure.
Thank you for coming. So for people who may not be say early childhood education practitioners or just teachers, what about those who either work for or with maybe in higher institutions of education? How can this research and this work that you talked about really help them address this issue of opportunity gaps?
Yes. So I think that at the college level, well, for one, when you talk about sort of other people like clinicians and practitioners, what I would suggest is, there are tons of materials, especially when you look in the counseling field. There's lots of materials in counseling about multicultural counseling and about ethnicity and race that are coming from that field. In terms of the practitioners and the clinicians that support early childhood education in particular, you and I have that book, the CRAFT model, that talks about sort of how practitioners and clinicians can sort of apply that same model in their work that they're doing with children outside of the classroom. But in terms of higher education in particular, I think that how we can best address sort of this culturally relevant and anti-bias framework in college is by mentoring students, sort of direct mentorship with graduate and undergraduate students via one-on-one mentorship or professional development mentorship, or even mentorship through different clubs and student organizations. And then the other thing is by changing the course content in our higher ed courses. And so in higher ed, we tend to have more flexibility around sort of the content that we can teach within our classes. And so it's a beautiful opportunity for professors to be able to change their content so that their students have to read more literature, around these issues and become informed.
Great, thank you. And I would add, as obviously as moderator, I would also just add that it also requires then that the professors themselves, as well as the school leadership, also become much more familiar with a lot of the resources that you presented, right? So that they also are familiar with it as well as their students.
I agree.
So then that just kind of hits a little bit into one of the questions that kind of came about in terms of the extent to which the measure that we're developing, the access, could assess the cultural competence of organizations. Right now it's focused on teacher, child, social cultural interactions. How is there a possibility to kind of think about it at a higher level, like the organizations that the schools and teachers are part of?
Wow. I guess you could do that. I had not thought about that, but I think that's actually a great idea. I am sitting here smiling and laughing to myself because I'm thinking, wow, more work. But yes, I think that's actually a great idea. And I think that if you want to make change, you have to think about change at multiple levels, that classroom level, that program level, even the system level. And I can say that at the system level, I'm working with Diane Schilder. We're doing a project actually for Build, where we're looking at sort of the system, the early childhood system, and we have several items, and we're looking intentionally about sort of how the system promotes sort of equity and inclusion. So at that wider system level, I think that there are tools being created in the policy world to do that. And at the program level, I think we still need something though.
So how would you, as somebody who definitely works with a lot of teachers and practitioners, how would you support teachers or early care education, workforce people, to be able to confront and identify the culture and racial biases, right, to support, children and students of color? So what would be sort of some of your, bullet points about how do you support teachers to begin to really confront some of these biases that all of us have, but are particularly pejorative for children of color?
I think that teachers, for one, I think just structurally, we need to institute professional development, a system of professional development that specifically addresses this issue. And it needs to be a required focus and topic within professional development, and it needs to occur repeatedly. So not just sort of one class in your pre-service training and not just sort of one in-service in your professional career. It needs to be something that is that occurs regularly. I would also say that there just has to be work. That I think that it's just really a matter of being committed to sort of continuous work and continuous improvement, and a commitment to make interactions better for all of us. So for people, from all sides, the people coming from the called communities as well as the non-called communities, really thinking and reflecting on sort of our interactions, our biases, and being committed to to come to the table to constantly learn and to know that we're not always going to get it right and that we are going to make mistakes, but not being afraid, and being willing to talk about it and to try to work through these changes. There were, when you read, if anybody reads the Curenton Institute report, in that report they mentioned how some businesses have engaged in what they call these de-biasing trainings, and I have yet to really to get knowledge, to get like concrete information about sort of what those de-bias trainings sort of look like in the corporate world, because that's the private industry. But I would imagine from what the report said is that those types of things are actually successful. So if they are successful in the private sector, I would hope that they would also be successful in our public education sector. And I think that aspects of those trainings should be incorporated into our in-service professional development and into our pre-service professional development.
Great. Thank you for that resource. What are your thoughts, or what are your response to when you get questions or comments about well, things like this only elevate the problem, or that we need to be more colorblind. What are your responses to that when you hear those kind of things?
Nobody says that to me directly, but I would say that if someone said that to me, I would say to them that it's important for them to educate themselves and start to read the literature and get information, because it is well known that this notion of being colorblind is actually sort of a form of, it's actually a denial of racism, which some would interpret is a form of racism in itself. So, so that idea, so I'm surprised that there would be teachers and educators within this current sort of generation of teachers that we're training, and maybe teachers that are in my cohort, that would think that philosophy, that colorblind philosophy, is really adequate and appropriate, anymore. So I guess the answer to that, the short answer to that, is to really think about how to educate people so that they know that that it's really impossible to have a colorblind ideology, and that such an ideology actually hurts and harms called children in the long run. And it hurts and harms white children too.
So just in the last couple of minutes, and I know I'll turn over back to Patricia, but just the last question I have for you is thinking about obviously the research that you're engaged in, and I'm happy to be one of your collaborators on those sort of things. What other areas of research do we need to know about, especially as it concerns how do we address issues of equity and ensuring the excellence of young children? So what are some of the things that you think are still big gaps in the field that we need to know more about?
Oh, wow.
Just a couple. I know you have a lot of thoughts. Just a couple would be good.
So my favorite thing, and this is what comes to the forefront of my mind now because it's what I'm working on, my favorite thing is really about language, and really about sort of this idea of how teachers are using language and conversations in the classroom, and how the way that language is used is related to sort of issues of culturally responsiveness and equity. So the classic example that I shared with Martita, so I'm really interested and passionate about how children are given voice in the classroom, and how teachers and how their peers talk with them. And I think that there's a gap in the literature related to that, to sort of looking at conversations, like in the quality of conversations in early childhood classrooms in that way. I also think that there is room in our literature and in our body of work to really sort of more systematically incorporate all the work related to housing and education. So that's like a big thing that I'm very much interested in. And I mentioned the book by LaRue and Goyette, and it's called Choosing Homes, Choosing Schools. And it is within that book, they're trying to sort of piece together sort of the literature from housing and education.
Well, Stephanie, with that, I want to say thank you so much for your powerful, powerful webinar, especially during this time of the semester when things are ending. So I just appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. And I thank all those who are in webinar land for being part of the session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patricia. Thank you so much again, Stephanie. I really, really appreciate and enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again so much to everyone who joined us today. Especially thank you to our speakers for sharing your important work, as well as thank you to everyone who asked such thought-provoking questions. If you enjoyed today's webinar, you may be interested in future consortium webinars. We are hoping to have one more webinar this academic year. Details are still being finalized, but it will likely be the first week in June. So please check the consortium website and listserv in the coming weeks for additional details. There are no consortium webinars in the months of July and August, and the 2017-2018 webinar series will begin in the fall. You can join the consortium listserv to receive notifications about future webinars, a quarterly newsletter, as well as job and event announcements. And in my follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar today, I will attach a copy of today's slides as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar, which will be posted on SRCD's YouTube channel. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.